Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast with me, Adrian Goldberg, live on the Byline Supplement with the Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov. This time was Keir Starmer's speech unveiling new measures to reduce immigration, his Enoch Powell moment. Many of us, probably most of us, would acknowledge that it is not intrinsically racist to discuss the scale of migration to the UK and have measures in place to regulate it. But as the Prime Minister laid out his plans in Downing Street this week, the language around it was, at the very least, fascinating, and to some, it was horrifying. At the same time as saying that he celebrated diversity, Starmer said that we risk, and I quote, becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. As the backbench MP Zara Sultana pointed out, this echoed the infamous Rivers of Blood speech made by Enoch Powell in 1968. Sultana, currently suspended from the Labour whip, said that Starmer's words add to anti-migrant rhetoric that puts lives at risk. Now, Adam, we can't know for sure if Starmer was deliberately drawing a parallel with Enoch Powell, who the white British population found themselves made strangers in their own country. That word again, strangers. But it does seem an unfortunate, or perhaps from Starmer's perspective, a fortunate parallel.
Yes, well, I think there hasn't been an explicit denial as of yet. I think Yvette Cooper distanced herself from it on the radio this morning. I think lots of people will be tempted to give them the benefit of the doubt. However, I think it's worth saying that there is a kind of pattern here. Indeed, even in the same speech, he was talking about open borders experiment, taking back control. So there are these kind of deliberate echoes of at least the hard right, if not the far right, that's been going on for some time. And also in the recent local elections, the Labour campaign put up lots of online adverts with cues of shadowy migrants in a deliberate echo of Nigel Farage's famous Breaking Point poster. So we don't know whether this was a deliberate reference to Enoch Powell, but I wouldn't be massively surprised if that were the case, given what we know about the direction that the Labour government is currently going in, and given we know the strategy that the advisors around Keir Starmer are persuading him to pursue at the moment.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that other quote that you mentioned when he described what has happened since 2019 as a one nation experiment in open borders conducted on a country that voted for control. Now, that sense of significant numbers of migrants being something that is visited upon the indigenous population of the UK, or indeed on any country, is very much the language of the, I would say, far right, the people who complain about the globalists somehow trying to mix races together. He didn't use that language, but it just unquestionably evokes that and has echoes of that. And I can't believe that the people around Starmer, people who are steeped in political law, would not know that.
And we also have to remember this is happening now within a year where we've had racist far right riots on the streets of the UK, when a lot of these same pursued by people who use a lot of this same messaging. So they know what they're doing. Whether or not that was that particular line was a deliberate echo of the Rivers of Blood speech, we don't know. But the overall tone and the overall strategy is pretty clear at this point.
One of the ironies, and again that evocation of taking back control is significant here, is that I think it's a fair thing to suggest that many of the people who voted for Brexit, seeing it as an end to the migration of workers from other parts of the European Union, open borders and so on. And they interpreted taking back control as significantly reducing migration. In fact, we have had the opposite, haven't we, since Brexit? We've had a points-based visa system for workers coming into the UK. And that suggests that employers have actually been rather desperate to get more workers from abroad. 2023, it was a net migration in the UK reached 906,000. It fell back in 2024 to 728,000. We'll look at some of the sectors that are responsible for that net migration to the UK. But it does suggest that there is a significant demand within the British economy for skills from abroad of one sort or another that we can't meet from within our own country.
Yeah, and as you say, this is a long-term situation. It's not suddenly going to turn around on the basis of one Prime Minister's speech. Although it is worth saying that as you say, net migration is down from a high of around 900,000 down to last year, around 700,000. The OBR estimate is actually going to be dramatically cut over the next couple of years to around 300,000. So I think the sensible position for a Labour government to be taking at this point is to bank that cut and say, look, we've taken measures, they're working, whether or not that cut is down to the Labour government or not, they can make that case and say, look, but immigration is still very high, perhaps there's more that we can do, but also make the case for immigration, as Keir Starmer committed that he would do when he was running for Labour leader. He said the Labour government needed to make the case for immigration. And there is a case for immigration because, of course, you can cut immigration to net zero immigration, as Nigel Farage is calling for. There's obviously huge costs to that. And if you look at the OBR, even on a sort of much more modest scenario of reducing immigration to around 100,000, the OBR forecast that would put a hole in the economy of around 14 billion a year. Now, you can do that, but how are you going to pay for that? Is that going to lead to more cuts to the NHS, to schools? Our voters are going to thank you for that. So I think it's all very well ramping up the rhetoric as the Prime Minister is doing, but there are costs to this strategy. There are costs rhetorically and politically in terms of which of your voters you are alienating and which you're actually winning over. There's also economic costs to this. There are costs to, even in the individual measures, if you look at the decision to reduce reliance for care homes on overseas staff, that's going to lead to a lot of care homes struggling to stay open. If not, it's going to lead to increases in the cost of care for people. Are voters really going to thank Labour for pushing up the cost of care, for not being able to get their parents into care homes because care homes are closing? Are they going to thank them for waiting lists starting to go up again after falling in the first year of a Labour government? So these are all things that Labour should have been thinking about before they come out with a speech like this, because ultimately, whether or not the immigration is largely out of the government's hands. The reason we saw such a big spike over recent years is not because of particular government measures. It's because of the Ukraine war. It's because of COVID. It's because of the situation in Hong Kong. These are things that the government had relatively little control over, just as the government really has little control over the dramatic falls in immigration we're seeing now. And sort of reinforcing this link between government action and immigration levels is really dangerous for any government, but I think particularly for a Labour government.
If you look at the white paper which accompanied Starmer's speech and which outlines the various measures the government is going to introduce to reduce migration, they argue that migration has not been a trigger of economic growth, and they compare the UK's GDP with the United States and with other countries, all of whom on their graphs fare better than the United Kingdom, apart from Germany, which has had its own particular problems, not least weaning itself off its over-reliance on Russian oil, for example. But of course, that doesn't tell us what would have happened to GDP had migration on the scale with which you've experienced it not happen. We don't know the obverse of this.
Well, exactly. This was the argument that Keir Starmer was making yesterday, that there's no link between immigration and growth. But we just know that's not the case. And his argument, as you say, was to say, well, look, we've had stagnant growth and we've had high migration, therefore the two must be linked. But like you say, we don't know what the alternative scenario would have produced. So I think it's a very risky sort of logic for the government to be pursuing on that, really.
Yeah. In terms of the practicalities then, and as we say this, Adam, I think it's worth recognising. And clearly, even if you accept an argument for migration based on economic growth, there is an impact, at the very least in the short term, potentially on waiting lists for local GP surgeries, on school places, and so on. So I don't want to suggest. I mean, you will have your own view, but I don't want to suggest that migration doesn't come with some difficulties, and that there are adjustments that have to be made at a local community level. And I think a measured and a rounded view of migration would acknowledge. And the government's in demanding improved language skills, for example, for migrants, and not just migrants, but also for the families, the dependents of migrants. That doesn't strike me as being intrinsically racist or intrinsically wrong. To acknowledge, that there are pressures brought upon us by migration, pressure for housing, for example. So, I think there is a reasonable grown-up discussion to be had.
Absolutely. And, if you look at migration levels, they are historically at very high as compared to what was in previous decades. And there are individual implications for that for various sectors. But of course, there are, as I say, costs to reducing that you also have to take into account. But as you say, it has to be a careful discussion. And you have to do it from the basis of the facts and the pluses and cons of reducing immigration. You don't do it from the basis of talking about squalid conditions, saying this is, language of islander strangers, all this kind of. That isn't a sensible grown-up conversation about immigration, and that's not what Keir Starmer promised when he was running for Labour leader. That he said that we was going to have a return to a sensible adult conversation about the benefits of migration. And look, there's a political angle to this as well. It's long been the case that successful political campaigns are fought on your own, on ground where you are strong. We saw that during the Brexit referendum when the Leave campaign, they campaigned on immigration because they were on the strong ground on immigration, whereas the Remain campaign was on a much weaker ground. We've seen what's happened in recent elections around the world in other English-speaking countries. We've seen in Australia, a centre-left government returned to government on a sizable victory on the basis of playing down immigration as an issue. And it's not to say that they weren't putting in measures to tackle immigration, but they just weren't talking about it all of the time. They were moving on to other issues where they were strong, and their opponents, in this case was a sort of Trump-leaning anti-migration party on the right, they were trying to push the issue of immigration, and the Australian Liberals were dodging that and moving on to areas where they were, the Australian Labour Party, were moving on to ground where they were much stronger. It looks, and it's a similar situation in Canada where Mark Carney is pushing an anti-Trump position. It looks like Keir Starmer has kind of looked at what has worked in other centre-left governments in English-speaking nations. I thought, well, let's try and do the opposite of that and see how that works out. I don't think it's going to work out particularly well because who is pleased by this positioning from Keir Starmer? It's not the right-wing press. We saw the Daily Mail last couple of days condemning this as a betrayal of the British people. It's not the centre-left press. We saw the Guardian today with a splash criticising this as echoes of the far right. It's not Labour MPs, multiple Labour MPs coming out to condemn this. It's not business. It's not care homes. Who is pleased by Keir Starmer using this rhetoric and going in this political direction? We know who's pleased. It's Nigel Farage. It's Robert Jenrick, who was out on the radio this morning agreeing with the Prime Minister and actually going further. And so they're pleased because he is going on to their turf and they know that they can win that argument. So it's all very well Keir Starmer saying individual measures here and there that he thinks might bring migration down 10,000 here, 10,000 there. But then you've got Nigel Farage who can always say, well, I'm going to implement net zero migration. The Prime Minister can never top that. That you are fighting a fight that you can only ever lose. So I think it's incredibly dangerous on a moral level. It's incredibly dangerous on a political level for the Prime Minister to be pursuing this course.
Yeah, I suppose the question for people like Farage is, at what point do you say migration is ever acceptable, or what number does Starmer have to say is acceptable to his government to appease the Labour voters who might be tempted to vote for reform? If we've got this current figure, significant figure, 724,000. If he, for example, were to reduce net migration to 500,000 or 300,000, would that be enough to satisfy the reform-leaning red wall Labour voters? Well, if you've got Farage saying zero, even though 500,000 from where we are now would be, in inverted commas, a success, or 300,000 would be a success, it still wouldn't be the zero that Farage is offering.
So there's
Another thing, but yeah.
Exactly. So I think the sensible course of action for the government is to change the conversation. And it's to say, look, reform is in a strong position on this. The Conservatives, to a lesser extent, are on a strong position on this. What should we be talking about instead? Where should we be attacking reform where they are weak? And there's some really interesting analysis by The Economist magazine recently, which actually did what most journalists haven't done so far, which is actually look at the policies that reform have been proposing over the last year and actually put a cost to those policies. And they looked at everything that Nigel Farage and his party has proposed over the last couple of years, and they tallied it up, and it worked out there's £100 billion hole in the public finances should those policies be pursued, largely on the basis of big tax cuts to wealthy people. Now, why isn't Labour attacking them on that? I mean, that would absolutely dwarf the situation that we saw in Liz Truss's mini budget. That would either lead to the biggest austerity cuts that we've seen in the UK in our history, or it would lead to the literal bankrupting of the country. Why is the government not changing the argument to something like that? Why are they not changing the argument to reforms, views on foreign policy and Russia and all the rest of it? Why are they determined to fight reform on the ground where reform are strong and they are seen as weak? It's just baffling to me.
Yeah, this, it seems to me, is the high watermark, or at least the high watermark for now, of the blue Labour movement. Lord Maurice Glasman, a Labour peer, is one of the key architects of this, but it is, for people who aren't aware, has been described as a kind of socially conservative brand of Labourism, strong on patriotism, anti-immigration or anti-significant numbers of immigration. And clearly, it seems to me, Blue Labour has got the ear of Sir Keir Starmer now. And this chimes very much with their sense of what red wall Brexit supporting Labour voters might want to hear, some of whom at least will already have transferred their allegiance to Reform UK.
Yeah, a Blue Labour is a bit of it was formerly quite a sort of fringe group within the Labour movement. As you say, it started by this guy called Maurice Glasman, who is a very eccentric chap who's currently running to try and become a Republican politician in the United States. The other co-founder of the Blue Labour movement is a guy called Jonathan Rutherford, former communist, who now works for the right-leaning Tufton Street-based think tank Policy Exchange. Are these really the people that Labour want to be getting into bed with and pursuing? Are these really friends of and allies of the Labour Party? It's a curious move for the Labour Party to be going in that direction. But as you say, they do have a lot of influence. Maurice Glasman and Jonathan Ruffford are both supposedly have the ear of Morgan Mccreen, the Prime Minister's chief strategist and advisor, chief of staff. And they have been convinced that this is the strategy that they should go down. Essentially, that the Labour Party is seen as weak and soft on issues of immigration, on cultural issues, trans rights, etc., and to try and use this moment to neutralise that threat and to change how perceptions of Labour in the country. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem to be working. Support for Labour in the polls is in the low 20s. Reform, the party they're supposedly trying to neutralise, are on course to winning a 40-seat majority according to current polls. It doesn't seem to be working. In the local elections, one of the worst local election results for Labour in living memory. When is this strategy supposed to kick in? When is the strategy of supposedly winning over reform voters supposed to work? Because it's not working in terms of winning over reform voters. We can see that, and actually there isn't many reform voters left to squeeze on that side. But it does seem to be alienating people on the left, and there's much more potential on the left for voters to be alienated. If you look at the polls at the moment, it looks like most of the sort of reform curious former Labour supporters have already left the party. but there is a much bigger chunk of liberal and left-leaning voters who are still sticking with Labour. So if I was in Labour HQ, I would be worrying very strongly about what we're saying to those voters, that much bigger chunk of voters on the centre-left and left of Labour. What are we doing to hold on to those voters? Because this kind of rhetoric is, on this and lots of other issues, I think is really damaging. And I can only speak from my sort of social circles as well, anecdotally. People that I know, other commentators, many of whom have been very supportive of Starmer in recent years, have really kind of lost faith or losing faith with him rapidly, particularly on this issue of immigration. And that may not matter very much at the next general election, but it does raise that question of who is this really pleasing, other than Nigel Farage.
Yeah, well, again, just to give a bit more background on Blue Labour, back in 2011, Glasman was arguing that the UK should renegotiate its position on free movement with the European Union. He argued that Labour should seek to rally its supporters around, and I quote, family, faith and flag. And it seems to me that this is the trend of the Labour Party at the very top of the party. As you say, that may feel at odds with what people like Farage would characterise as the liberal metropolitan elite, but would also feel at odds with, I'd say, many traditional Labour voters. So,
well, the thing is, I mean, there's nothing wrong with patriotism, faith. There's nothing wrong with being pro-family, for instance. But the 2-child benefit limit is anti-family, and the government is opposing that. There's nothing wrong with being pro-flag. Mark Carney in Canada was pro-flag and led an anti-Trump campaign, which led to a massive surge in support and ultimate victory for the Canadian Liberals. There's nothing wrong with those principles, but you actually have to follow through in terms of policy. And nothing that the Labour government is pursuing at the moment really backs that up, other than this sort of attack on migration, which isn't even getting them the support of the Daily Mail, but it is probably going to lead to shortages in the care sector and the NHS, which voters will be very unhappy about in a few years' time, and will actually make it harder for Labour to win re-election.
Yeah, well, listen, let's go on to the substance of this then, Adam. I mean, in the care sector, I think last year, 58,000 workers came into the care sector under the skilled worker visa. 58,000 people. Now, people might quibble with the definition of what a worker visa constitutes, but were those people needed to do vital work in the care sector? Of course they were. Otherwise, they would not have been offered jobs. And it's one thing to identify that there are many hundreds of thousands of people who are not active in employment, but who are of working age in this country. The evidence suggests, and it suggests across decades, that people who are already in this country do not want to do those jobs. But that route to employment in the UK under these proposals will be banned. So where are those workers going to come from? Who is going to care for people, older people, people in care homes? Where is that care going to come from? Because if there is a shortage of labour in those areas, as these numbers would suggest, the only way you might potentially attract people into this workforce is by increasing the wages. But who pays the wages? Local authorities very often pay the wages, cash-strapped, almost bankrupt. I'm speaking to you from Birmingham, effectively bankrupt authorities who already can't afford to pay the minimum wage salaries of these workers in the care sector.
Absolutely, and there is a reasonable case to be made that there are certain sectors, including the care sector, which have become too reliant on overseas workers. And you can make that case on the basis of the resources of homes and schools and what it says about our economy. And these are all reasonable arguments to be made. And you can have a long-term strategy. And this is sort of across decades of trying to turn that around in terms of the infrastructure we have. But there are costs to immediately shutting that down. And in answer to your question, who is going to fill those jobs? Nobody is going to fill those jobs. There is not this massive of unemployed people waiting to go and work in care homes that can suddenly be plucked up. And so either they're going to have to pay more, which means that people are going to have to pay more for their social care, or local authorities are going to have to pay more for the social care, or care homes are going to close down. And people are not going to thank the Labour government for that situation if that comes to pass.
Another area that the government's keen to reduce migration in is higher education, and they're concerned about the number of visas to study. But again, there's a contradiction, isn't there? Because our higher education sector is going through a very turbulent financial moment and is heavily reliant on overseas students. You clamp down on overseas students and their dependents coming into the country. What situation does that leave our education sector?
There's an interesting piece in the Financial Times this morning from the commentator Stephen Bush, and he was saying that when the economy is doing well, these are kind of like what happens, the sort of who fills these jobs in the higher education sector and the social care sector. These are things you can worry about. But when the economy is not particularly growing very well, as it hasn't been over the last decade in the UK, when you've got these global factors like Trump's trade tariffs and the ongoing Ukraine war, caring about these issues as a government, or spending a lot of time and spending a lot of money on trying to fix these issues, is kind of a luxury that you can't really afford as a government. So yes, as I say, these are issues that probably do need to be resolved at some level. Needs to be there can be a long-term strategy to getting more homegrown workers in some of these sectors. Although, I think the being realistically, there's always going to be a reliance in the UK on people from overseas, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And there's actually some big advantages to it. But focusing solely on this and measuring the success of your government solely on the basis of these issues, I think it is a luxury concern, and it's a luxury that really Labour can't afford right now.
Yeah. And I'm just struck, Adam, and this is not the first time I've made this observation in relation to New Labour's stance and its language around migration. I'm a second generation migrant. My father came here as a refugee and served in the British Army, by the way, as we move on from the 80th anniversary celebration. BE Day, but he was somebody who fought for this country and helped to preserve the freedom of this country, having been born in another country. My partner was not born in the UK, but we all think of ourselves as British and raise our kids as British. But at the same time, when you have skilled people who are themselves potentially mobile, who might secure employment in other countries, does the language of Labour make me feel included in this country, make me feel wanted? Now, of course, Starmer was very careful to say, wasn't he, that he values the diversity of this country. But having said that, he then undercut it with almost everything else that he said. And you just think, well, if you've got people in this country who are mobile, and there are other countries perhaps around the world saying, oh, we'd love you to come and work in our country. We'd love you to bring your skills to our country. We appreciate what you do as migrants to our country. You might be tempted to go. And of course, people don't give up their homes, their jobs, their families on a whim. It takes more than the language of a politician. And of course, this is also partly a global phenomenon to some extent, what we're experiencing now. But I just think that sense of appreciation, that sense that we value migrants, that we might on occasions want more migrants than we currently that sense appears to have disappeared from the political discourse of this.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there's a risk for the government in this. They don't really understand this is personal for a lot of people. I mean, like yourself, I mean, one of the measures that has been brought in by recent months by this government is to stop anyone who arrives via a perilous journey, i.e. a small boat, can never be given UK citizenship. That was one of the measures that has been brought forward for at the moment. Now, my grandfather arrived in the UK via a perilous journey. He was a refugee from Poland, and by that measure, he would never have been allowed to get citizenship in the UK. But he came here and he joined the RAF and fought for our country. I thought that was the kind of thing that the Labour Party was in favour of. And I think the risk of this kind of rhetoric and this kind of politics is it does put people off put people from an immigrant background off. As I say, I'm from an immigrant background. My wife, her parents came here from Malta 40 odd years ago, and there are lots and lots of people around the UK in a similar position. I do think there's a risk of alienating people from these backgrounds. And when you're using language like island of strangers, when you're using words like squalid, and all the rest of it, I think you're at risk of alienating as many people, in fact, more people than you actually are winning over on these issues.
Yes. Andrew Hill asks us on the chat, what is the position of the other parties? I'll confess that I don't know what the Lib Dems have said about this. I know the Greens have been outspoken. Kemi Badenoch for the Conservatives said that she acknowledged that the Conservatives had got things wrong, didn't she, in terms of migration when the Tories were in power, Adam?
Yes, well, Robert Jenrick was on the radio this morning. He essentially agreed with the Prime Minister, but of course went further in terms of his rhetoric. And he was talking about the number of white British people that there are embarking in Dagenham and using this kind of very racialised language. We know what the position of Reform is, of course, whether they want net zero immigration. So, if you're going to pick a fight with these parties, they're always going to have a trump card that they can use against you as a centre-left government. As you say, I think the Greens are probably the only party really, Lib Dems to a lesser extent as well, who are kind of pushing a much more liberal approach to immigration at the moment.
Yeah, if you do pick a fight with anybody, make sure that it's not so serious that you end up needing treatment in hospital, where you will almost certainly have to be treated by a doctor who was born overseas or whose parents were born overseas. It's a glib response, maybe, but that's part of the issue. David Nichol, by the way, who joins in, David says Lib Dem policy from last year says we at the Lib Dems will be relentless in our focus on fixing social care. A Liberal Democrat King's speech, he says, would have included paid carers leave, care to be included as a protected characteristic. Thank you for that, David. And I just find, Adam, these are just such grim.
And I think the Lib Dems care policy is actually a good example of a kind of different approach to politics. And if you look at the ratings of the different leaders, Keir Starmer's ratings are now the worst of any political party leader in the country, with Kemi Badenoch slightly ahead of him. Nigel Farage is leading, is the most popular. His net approval rating is the most popular of any party leader. But just behind him is Ed Davey, who has taken a very different approach. And whatever people may think of the Lib Dems, by focusing on a sort of positive issue like fixing social care, and doing the videos where he talks about his own family situation and seems to actually care about the issue, I think that is a way of winning over people. And Lib Dems had a very good night in the local elections recently. They're picking up huge amounts of support from former Conservative voters who are not attracted to the Conservatives under Kemi Badenoch. There is a kind of alternative route there for a centre-left party that the Labour could be learning from. Instead, they're going down a different route of trying to be hard Labour, rather than caring Labour. And I think that's a real mistake that Keir Starmer is making at this point.
Yeah, Jacob Jepson makes an interesting point as well, says that the SNP in Scotland are also broadly pro-immigration, which has implications next year for Scottish Labour. And I think that touches on a really important point, I think, in that there are parts of the United Kingdom, both Scotland and Wales, where there are labour shortages and where broadly there is a different conversation about immigration, particularly relating to immigration in the workforce, than there is in England.
Yes, absolutely. There's different situation in Scotland. Parties in Scotland have tended to be more pro-migration. I mean, I guess the counter to that would be say the sort of pressures in the southeast are, in terms of housing and etc., are greater. So perhaps it's more of an issue down here. But as I say, ultimately, I don't think immigration is not the issue that Labour can win the next election on. What can still win the election? So I do think reform are eminently beatable for all of the reasons I've set out so far. But I think if voters are feeling that they're better off, if they're feeling that the economy has grown, that their wages have gone up, that more housing is being built, that NHS waiting times have come down, and actually they have come down, and you can see that in the opinion polls in terms of people's concern about the NHS has actually decreased since the general election, partly because of what the Labour government has done since coming into government. They need to be focusing on those kind of cost of living, the lifestyle issues that will win them the next election. And of course, that's not what they're doing right now.
Yeah, well, we'll keep going for, if you're all right, for another 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
You've got things to do, but getting some very interesting comments in on the chat. Den Howlett says, is this a case of Morgan Mccreen overreaching by channeling a strategy that might have worked in Dagenham, but which is outdated in a social media dominated world? Now, for people who don't know the background of this, I don't know if you know any more than I do, Den, but I've been listening to the fabulous book that I'm always name checking these days, Get In, by Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire, which is the story essentially of Morgan Mccreen's role in the Starmer movement at Labour. And Morgan Mccreen cut his teeth in Barking and Dagenham when the BNP were very strong, and he'd got great experience of door knocking and finding out what constituents really were concerned about, and then also allied that to a fantastic use of data. And I've got to say, having read that book, Den, I'm tempted to think that if you understand where Morgan Mccreen has come from politically, you can see his paw prints all over this strategy. And you're right, maybe it did work in Barking and Dagenham, and by extension, therefore, it might work in other deprived working class communities where constituents might be persuaded to vote for reform. But what works in Barking and Dagenham does not necessarily extend to the whole of the United Kingdom in all of its glorious complexity.
There have been some people, I think, that have, within the Labour movement, who have questioned the kind of mythology around Morgan Mccreen's role in that campaign in Dagenham, the BNP. But that, let's give him credit for that. But I think the reason we're talking so much about Morgan Mccreen and why there's so much coverage of Morgan Mccreen is that we don't really know what the Prime Minister believes himself. And this.
Sorry to interrupt, Adam, but again, that is kind of one of the key insights of the book, is that he doesn't really seem to have those kind of political chops and much is made in the book of how other Labour leaders, whatever their political persuasion, will happily spend or would have spent hours in political discourse. What's the best policy? What's the best idea? This does not seem to animate Starmer.
No, and if you talk to Labour ministers, they're not really sure where they're going a lot of the time. So they don't feel confident making public statements or pursuing policy initiatives because they're never really sure what the Prime Minister actually believes. And there's good reason for that. When you compare what Keir Starmer was saying in opposition and when he was standing for the Labour leadership with what he's saying now, it's night and day. He said that he committed to defending free movement as we left the EU. Well, now he's condemning free movement. He said he was committed to defending migrant rights. He's now reducing migrant rights. And as on migration, as on lots of other issues. I think we've seen that today in some of the coverage. The Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, who's had a terrible time recently, is now this morning able to put out clips of Keir Starmer saying lots of pro-migration things in the past and comparing it to what he's saying now. That was a complete open goal that Labour has, that Keir Starmer has given his political opponents on this. So yes, I think that's why we're hearing so much about Morgan Mccreen now, is because we don't really know what the Prime Minister actually believes. Is it the Prime Minister? Is it the Keir Starmer of 2020, or is it the Keir Starmer of 2025 saying he really believes in ending the squalid situation of high migration?
Yeah. Just one final thought, Adam, and this has not really been picked up, but in truth, I think that a lot of what powers anti-migrant sentiment is an unspoken hatred of Islam and of Muslims. And I think some of the language around this, and I think some of the imagery around this, without mentioning Muslims, is what drives this. And I think that's part of what drives Reform UK. And I think, and this is this is a sense I have that, I can't evidence.
No, sorry, I completely agree.
This is a sense I have that when we talk about migration, they mean Muslims. They mean people who are visibly other. And I think some of the undercurrent of this is deeply, deeply unpleasant and deeply racist.
Well, we saw that today in Robert Jenrick's response to Keir Starmer's speech, where he was talking about Sharia, talking about grooming gangs. It's less a kind of dog whistle than a foghorn, really, at this point. So yes, that absolutely is a big part of that. And I think there is a kind of moral obligation on any politician, but I think particularly a politician of the centre left, like the Prime Minister and his ministers, to be conscious of that. Be conscious of the far right riots we had on the streets. To be conscious of asylum hotels being attempted to be burned down by far right thugs, and to be conscious of the rhetoric that we see in places like GB News. The Home Secretary, after she announced her white paper yesterday, her first exclusive broadcast interview wasn't to the BBC, it wasn't to the ITV, it was to GB News. And she went on GB News, and the interviewer said, "Oh, some of our viewers, they've got asylum seekers living next to them, and they feel they can't let their children leave the house." Well, why? There was no pushback whatsoever from the Home Secretary on that. That is a racist statement, essentially.
Bearing in mind the white paper was not about asylum seekers; it is about legal migration.
And one reason why it is so significant is actually because asylum seekers is such a small part of net migration. Yes, there've been large numbers of small boats arrivals over recent years, but it's a tiny proportion of the total net migration. The big rises in net migration we've seen in recent years wasn't due to small boats. It was due to the Ukraine war. It was due to the situation in Hong Kong. These one-off circumstances, which are now sort of working themselves out, and the net migration is massively coming down. But the fact we spend so much time talking about small boats, the fact that the Labour Party are putting out adverts of shadowy faced sort of migrants in shadow, sort of breaking point type, Nigel Farage type posters, this is trying to play on essentially racist fears about asylum seekers, and about, as you say, there is that kind of undercurrent of fear of Islamophobia.
Mm. Depressing, but interesting. Thank you, Adam. Just a couple more comments. Sarah Cowley says he's labelled the Tories pandering to Reform's agenda. For example, anti-immigration, just helping Farage and Reform and not Labour or the Tories. I think Sarah, Adam and I both think the answer to that question is yes. Robert Campbell says time and time again, we're here with, we don't know where we're going. There is no vision for the goal of Labour Party policies. We, or rather they, are focused on what focus groups think and echoing what they think people want. This is not leadership. And just to tell you as well, we've got, and I always stress this, by the way, on these broadcasts, we are not partisan. We will hold any party to account. And that's what we think we're there for, to hold power to account. And we did it when the Tories were in power. Labour in power now, we hold them to account as well. That is our job as journalists. And the new edition of the Byline Times is almost ready to go to the press. It's going to the press, I think, on Thursday, and it will be headlined "Falling for Farage." So the new Byline Times going to the press on Thursday, falling for Farage. Do take out a subscription if you can. Head over to bylinetimes.com. That's where you'll find our news-breaking website. And the Byline Times is our brilliant monthly news periodical, edited wonderfully by Hardeep Matharu, and it contains the best of our online articles with content that you can't read anywhere else. So do head over, as I say, to bylinetimes.com. Thank you for watching and for listening to this. Thank you to Adam Bienkov. We're back again soon on the Byline Supplement and the Byline Podcast. See you. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Adrian.